Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Last week I spoke somewhat about the law of karma, and particularly how it relates to rebirth. I'd like to go into one particular related aspect of this, and that's the basis of ethics. And I think this is a good topic because there can be some confusion about the finer points. As I mentioned in last week's talk, the position in Buddhism has been that karma is ultimately made by the mind, so that acts which are done accidentally or unknowingly are not karmically effective. They don't have a weight of karma, and you're not breaking a precept if you do something by accident or you don't know that you're doing it. As a side note to this, there is some few cases in monks of India where you can break a rule unknowingly, which it's not an ethical breach, but it's a technical breach of the rule that needs to be confessed. And the one that comes up very often with us is you get some allowable in the afternoon, like a piece of chocolate, and you bite into it and there's a nut inside or something like that, or you find out it's milk chocolate, then you've broken the rule against taking solid food in the afternoon, but you didn't do it with forethought or deliberately. But this is a minor technical point that's really only of concern for the bhikkhus. In terms of the general ethical considerations that apply to everyone, an act is karmically negative only if it's done knowingly and deliberately. And the actual moment of creating the bad karma is created in the mind. So that karma becomes, in a sense, a balancing of mind states. For wholesome or positive, skillful states, whatever term you want to use, the technical term in kusala, which most literally means skillful. So these are what we call quote unquote good deeds, or akusala is unskillful or bad deeds. For every skillful action you create, then you will receive a resultant moment of pleasant arising. So that it's kind of like an accounting system, universal ethical accounting system that, always the books always balance, that what you put in, you get out. So the actual physical act is important only in that it takes a greater number and a greater strength of mental moments to consummate a physical action than it does just to think about it. If you conceive in your mind the wish you're angry at somebody, you conceive in your mind the wish to kill him, that's already creating bad karma for you, the mental moment of ill will in the mind. But that's minor relative to if you actually go out and hunt him down and kill him, because that takes a great deal more effort. There's many more mind moments, and it's actually significantly heavier karma. So the actual physical action at the end of the chain itself is, without the mental component, is of relatively minor importance. Example that's often given, I've heard this, I don't know who came up with this, but I've heard this given as a thought experiment to the importance of intention behind the action, is a man sticks a knife into another man's belly. And that act could be either positive, negative, or neutral. It's positive if he's a surgeon and he's trying to save the man's life. It's negative if he's a thief and he's robbing the man. And it's neutral if he's standing on the corner peeling a piece of fruit with a paring knife, and this guy carelessly runs around the corner and impales himself on his knife. There's no karma there, either positive or negative. So this is kind of a artificial thought experiment type example to highlight the role of intention in karmic action. And this is where I wanted to focus the importance of not misunderstanding that principle, because it can be taken wrongly and abused and twisted to mean that you can do something that would otherwise be very negative or evil as long as your intention is good. There's a perhaps apocryphal, I don't know, a saying that was attributed to an American general in the Vietnam War who said that we destroyed the village in order to save it. And this is also plays out many times in life with the philosophy of the ends justify the means, which is one that's not supported by the Buddhist idea of ethics. The means themselves are ethically significant. I think there's a difference here in the understanding of ethics between the Theravada and the Mahayana. That has it's a theoretical difference, but it has a way of playing out into the real world. In the Mahayana, and using Mahayana is should preface this by saying Mahayana is a very loose kind of term. It's a very broad brush. There's many different schools and branches within Mahayana, and some may not accept this idea, but I think it's the majority of Mahayana schools would. The idea that compassion is the most important thing in ethical considerations, and compassion is actually like a trump card that beats the precepts. So you can break any precept if it's done out of compassion and not make any negative karma. One example of this is a story that occurs in the Mahayana Jataka tales. The Jataka tales are the stories of the Buddha's past lives. And there's quite an extensive collection. In the Theravada version, there's over 500 Jataka stories. And many of them are also found in the Mahayana, but they have some different ones as well. And one of the stories that's only found in Mahayana collections concerns the Bodhisattva, that is the Buddha in a previous life. The Bodhisattva was born as a human being, and he became a merchant and went to sea with 500 merchants. And the Bodhisattva had, because of his past merit, he had psychic powers, and he could read minds. And he knew that one of these 500 was actually a thief and a pirate, and he had a plan to kill everyone in the night and take over the ship and steal all the treasure. So the Bodhisattva killed him before he could carry out his plan. And he was seized by the crew of the ship and thrown overboard as a murderer. So he knew this would happen, so he was sacrificing his own life as well. But by this act of killing, he had saved the rest of the merchants and the crew of the ship. So he'd saved many lives by taking one life. And he did this act out of compassion for the other people on the ship. So that's a story that would not be approved of in the Theravada collection. You would not find an approval of a negative act done out of compassion. It can and does play out into the actual real world. I've seen arguments made citing this particular Jataka as a justification for going to war. Now, if we go to war and, overthrow Saddam Hussein, then we'll save many more lives than will be lost. And so it's a compassionate act to go to war. And it comes up in the context of other precepts as well. In the Tibetans, in some branches, I don't want to say this is true of all Tibetan Buddhists because it's not, but in some corners of Tibetan Buddhism, they have this idea of crazy wisdom, that whatever you do, if it's done out of compassion, it might be considered completely immoral by the standards of the world or by the standards of the precepts. But if you're wise enough to, compassionate enough, you can transcend all those precepts. And this has been several times used as a justification for a violation of third precept and incidents of sexual misconduct in Vajrayana spiritual communities. The master was just being compassionate. This individual obviously needed some physical affection for their well-being, so he gave it to them. He was acting out of compassion. So this is, to me, and I think to people who think in the Theravada way generally, this idea of compassion as a trump card in ethics is a dangerous principle. The Mahayana criticism of the Theravada approach is that it's too straight, narrow, too sort of puritanical and legalistic. That we take the precepts for what they say and don't allow ourselves to make exceptions because of compassion or anything else. So we're deficient in compassion and we're overly legalistic. But I think the Theravada approach to me is much safer. And it doesn't allow it doesn't allow the entrance of the defilements into the mind to make excuses. Not nearly to the same degree as in the Mahayana approach. Who knows? It may be possible for a highly attained bodhisattva to be able to judge all the karmic connections and fruits of an action and make a decision that violates the precept and still do good. But for the run-of-the-mill of mortals, it just opens a door for them to be able to make excuses for their actions. I'm just doing it out of compassion. And the ends justify the means. One sort of absurd example of this is Chungmen Trungpa, who was a Vajrayana teacher in North America, very, very famous. And he had rather loose attachment to the precepts. And for one thing, he was a very heavy consumer of alcohol. And he would often be drunk in the midst of his community. And he said his excuse for that was that his ordinary consciousness was so highly evolved that there's no way he could teach or relate to ordinary people unless he dumbed it down with a massive amount of alcohol first. So he could come down to your level and talk to you. So this is a kind of, it sounds a bit silly, but it's an example of the idea of ends justifying the means. If we were to take what he said seriously, then the end is being able to relate and teach to people, which is a very positive, good thing. So anything which, in his excuse, is anything I do to attain that end is justified. And I think that this approach of the ends justifies the means, is a general principle of which compassion as the trump card is a specific case. I think this approach in the world is very dangerous and leads to much trouble in the world when it's carried through. It's very hard to think of examples where literally keeping the precepts does harm. Somebody may be ingenious enough to come up with some scenario, but generally the purpose of the precepts is not to do harm in the world. It's to reduce suffering. And if they're followed, then there's less suffering in the world. And the karma is made in the mind by the actor because the keeping the precepts involves positive mental states. And in fact, they encourage and foster positive mental states. When you take the 5 precepts or the 8 precepts or the 10 precepts, the Pali formula ends with Sikkhapadani Samadhiyami, which is I will follow this path of training, or I will endeavor to follow this path of training. So the precepts are seen not as rules or commandments, but as training precepts, because they develop the mind. It's a practice in itself, and a powerful one, to continually make an effort to keep the precepts. And this works by habituating the mind to wholesome states. And I like to use the homey expression, faking it till you make it. A good example of that is the first precept against not killing. And I like to tell people in the summertime when there's millions of mosquitoes around that the mosquitoes are your teachers. They're teaching you harmlessness. No, most people who come here, I think, I'm sure everybody is advanced enough that they don't have homicidal impulses. They don't feel like killing people and have to restrain themselves from that kind of physical violence. But killing a small creature like a mosquito is a much less effort involved, and it's a much more trivial thing in the eyes of the world. So most people in the world, who are not particularly trying to follow the Buddha's teachings, they think nothing of swatting a mosquito. It's just a casual thing. It's all automatic. So when you seriously take the first precept to begin with, it's an effort of restraint to not kill a mosquito. The natural impulse arising in your mind is, this little bugger's buzzing around my ear and I want to swat him. You have to restrain yourself by an effort of will not to do that. So at first it's difficult, but then over time, if it's done as a practice, you're seriously trying to keep first precept, it becomes easier and easier, and it becomes in the end natural. And if you're trying to just gently brush a mosquito away and you accidentally kill it, then you might feel a little bit bad about that, which you, at the beginning, you would not have concerned about that at all. So the mind has been habituated to more wholesome states. And here's where compassion comes in. Is compassion is developed and fostered as a result of keeping the precept. But in the first instance, you're not restraining from killing the mosquito out of compassion for the mosquito. That might be part of it, but it's not the primary motivation. The primary motivation is to purify your mind states, to not have the impulse of killing and violence in the mind. Another point that I would like to at least briefly discuss comes up when giving a talk on ethics or the precepts. Sometimes we get questions where people pose scenarios and say, is this good karma or bad karma? In secular philosophy, dealing with ethics, they sometimes call these lifeboat questions, right? You're in a lifeboat and there's, you have to throw somebody overboard. Who's it going to be? These sort of artificial scenarios, and what's the correct answer? And you can spin out all kinds of bizarre ethical dilemmas, moral dilemmas. And very often there's not a simple answer. And leaving aside artificial scenarios, in real life, in day-to-day situations, we often face kind of complex ethical decisions. And it becomes uncertain, what's the correct action. And something that's, I think, overlooked often in considering these things is that there is a category of karma called mixed. There's said to be 4 classes or categories of karma. Bright karma leading to bright results, dark karma leading to dark results, mixed karma leading to both dark and bright results, and the karma which leads beyond karma, which is seeking liberation, because all of karma and ethics is within the realm of conditionality and samsara. So good and evil are categories within conditionality. Ajahn Payutto's book on karma is titled Good, Evil, and Beyond, covering these 3 categories. But there is this 4th category, is mixed karma. And this very often the actions we take in the world have mixed results. They do some good and they do some evil. An example I've heard given is from Thailand. This example that comes out of Thailand is somebody's talking about this. What about the Department of Health workers who come and spray insecticide and kill the malaria mosquitoes? Malaria in some corners of the country is a serious problem and people die from it. And eradicating the mosquitoes is the only way to get rid of malaria. It's the only way to stop the disease spreading. So you can't say if this is good or bad. This is a mixed action with mixed results. There's bad karma for killing mosquitoes and good karma for helping the people in the village near the swamp. And when you're faced in your own life with a dilemma of some action that has mixed results, this is when this comes up, it's very important to examine intentions and to decide if the intention is a wholesome one. And even the same action carried out might have a different weighting of positive and negative depending on the mind state of the actor. If somebody goes in to spray the mosquitoes filled with loathing and hatred of mosquitoes and just big desire to kill mosquitoes, and that's the primary thing in his mind, that's different from somebody else who goes in to do it thinking about the saving the little children in the village who are sick with malaria, and how can we prevent this from happening. So it's not as simple. The ethical concerns are not always a simple thing, and one has to weigh the options and examine the state of mind and the intention in the mind, and to always try and fall back to keeping the precepts in a say a narrow or defined way. That this is always the safest course. If the precepts are the guide stone, then you're not allowing yourself much wiggle room for performance of acts that you might fool yourself into thinking are beneficial, but are actually coming out of the defilements. So I'll stop at that for this evening.
And Mayam Dhamma Kataya Sadhu Karam Dadamase Sadhu Sadhu Sadhu